Ever wondered why an important region of Spain such as Catalonia was never a kingdom? I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in this episode I will explain how Catalonia came to be and why Catalonia was a principality instead of a kingdom. Let's start with a basic question. What is Catalonia? By this I don't mean a simple description of where this region is located. For those unfamiliar with Spain, it's in the northeast of the Iberian Peninsula. But rather I mean the deeper meaning of its identity. Catalonia is a political and geographical concept that represents the dominance of Barcelona over a specific area. Or, in other words, without a strong Barcelona exerting its influence over a wide radius, Catalonia will not exist. Catalonia is fundamentally a Barcelona-centric idea, which is why we often see its history through a Barcelona lens. As we will see in the chronological series of New History of Spain, subscribe if you wanna see that, back in the 9th or 10th centuries, there were no significant power differences among the counts of the region that will be later known as Catalonia. For example, the counts of the Pyrenean counties of Cerdanya and Urgell could fight the Count of Barcelona head-to-head. The county of Empúries in the eastern coast of Catalonia was more powerful than Barcelona in terms of naval power, which is why it was the main target of a campaign of the Caliphate of Córdoba in 935. This lack of prominence of the county of Barcelona has much to do with the fact that the city of Barcelona was still fairly insignificant. It is estimated to have had a population of no more than 1,500 within its walls, with an unknown number, probably a few thousand, residing outside. Therefore, when we talk about the Catalan counties between the 9th and 11th centuries, we do it anachronistically, but out of convenience, because otherwise we have no way to collectively designate these territories that still lacked a sense of unity. But in the second half of the 11th century, things began to change, and the Count of Barcelona stood out from the rest of the counts and obtained vassalage from some of them. By the 12th century, the Count of Barcelona had direct possession of the counties of Girona, Osona, Besalú, Cerdanya, Roussillon, and Pallars Jussá. And it was no longer possible to say that these were counties with their own political autonomy. They were in fact integrated into a greatly expanded county of Barcelona compared to its original boundaries from the 9th century, and even more so with the conquests of Lleida and Tortosa in today's Western Catalonia by 1149. In this context, the concept of Catalonia arises from at least the beginning of the 12th century, as a political region that included this enlarged county of Barcelona, as well as the counties of Urgell, Empúries, and Pallars Sobirà. As the term County of Barcelona was no longer suitable to describe the political reality that was emerging, in the last medieval centuries this concept was abandoned in favor of the term Principality of Catalonia. We must distinguish three stages in the formation of Catalonia: an early medieval stage where no county stood out, a second stage between the second half of the 11th century and the first half of the 13th century, when the term Catalonia was first used to describe this region, but common institutions were not yet developed, and a third stage in the mid-13th century, where further centralization of power in Barcelona occurred and the Principality of Catalonia was politically articulated with common political institutions and laws. It was in the 13th century that the idea of the Principality of Catalonia as a res publica began to take hold, a political community in which the government is shared among several prominent individuals, as opposed to the idea of the government of one person or the few. And it was in the 14th century when the definitive steps were taken to give more political content to the idea of Catalonia by institutionalizing the Catalan courts and making them meet annually. This is seen, for example, in 1349, when King Peter IV of Aragon defended in a judicial process against the King of Mallorca and the Count of Roussillon and Cerdanya that these last two counties were part of Catalonia and its principality according to the Catalan laws and constitutions. Or in the General Courts of Monzon in 1376, where the three branches of Catalonia, namely representatives of the nobility, clergy, and the royal estates, represented by towns and cities, discuss extraordinary taxes. Throughout the 15th century, the concept of the Principality of Catalonia grew in popularity in official documentation and among the common people. Only on rare occasions was Catalonia referred to officially and unofficially as the Kingdom of Catalonia. For example, when James the Conqueror rhetorically described in his chronicle Catalonia as the best and most noble kingdom of Spain, Spain meaning the Iberian Peninsula. Or when the official records spoke of general courts being convened for the three kingdoms of the Crown of Aragon, in reference to Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia. In any case, it must be kept in mind that officially Catalonia was a principality and not a kingdom. This leads me to the next questions, which are what a principality is and what differences exist in theory and in practice between a principality and a kingdom. A principality is a form of government and a category of a political entity with a prince as head of a state. The etymology of the concept of principality leaves no room for doubt, as it comes from the Latin noun principatus, which in ancient times meant sovereignty or supremacy, and the ruler of a principality is a prince. The term prince etymologically comes from the Latin princeps, which in the Latin and Christian world meant the foremost or first among equals, as if the ruler had not much more power or higher rank than other elites. But we can also translate it as sovereign or ruler. In this case, the prince is not a crown prince. We are not talking about the Principality of Wales, led by the successor to the British throne, or the Principality of Asturias, Girona, or Viana, which were linked to the heir of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre respectively, and currently to the heir or heiress of the Kingdom of Spain. It's important to note that since the 10th century, when the Catalan counties were de facto sovereign, their counts sometimes titled themselves princeps, as a display of their sovereignty. This was an honorary title that was not institutionalized and was simply used occasionally in documentation. The practice of calling themselves princes was especially done by the counts of Barcelona, so it's not surprising that Catalonia eventually became a principality. In the usages of Barcelona, which were the fundamental laws of Catalonia that began to be compiled in the second half of the 12th century, the Count of Barcelona is referred to as a prince, and the Catalan region where he exercised his authority is occasionally mentioned as a principality. Historical examples of principalities include the Principality of Catalonia itself, some Crusader principalities in Palestine like Antioch or Galilee, or Slavic principalities such as that of Moscow. And currently, the microstates of Andorra, Monaco, and Liechtenstein hold the rank of principality. The main difference between a principality and a kingdom lies in their rank. Within the most standard feudal ranking, a principality ranks lower than a kingdom and higher than a duchy. And principalities were smaller in extension and population than most kingdoms. This is in theory, because in practice the difference between a kingdom and a principality may be only in name, and there may be no perceptible inferiority compared to other political communities categorized as kingdoms. This is precisely the case of Catalonia, which in practice was equivalent to kingdoms such as Aragon, Valencia, or Naples. This is not just something I'm making up. It can be verified with some data, and I doubt anyone will accuse the Castilian writer Miguel de Cervantes or the conquistador Martín Fernández de Enciso of being Catalan nationalists when they spoke naturally of the Kingdom of Catalonia. The princes of Catalonia had royal powers such as enacting laws or administering justice. They legitimized their sovereignty by the grace of God and the defense of the land. And they were not vassals of a king or emperor, as was often the case with other entities called principalities. The Count of Barcelona became de facto King of Aragon in 1137 after King Ramiro II of Aragon retired and transferred royal authority to his son-in-law Ramon Berenguer IV from the House of Barcelona. It is important to emphasize this because in Spain, just as there are many regional nationalists against anything that smells Spanish, meaning Castilian, there are also in Spain many anti-Catalan illiterates who go around lying saying things like Catalonia was a county of Aragon. The Crown of Aragon was composed of multiple kingdoms and lordships with their own laws and institutions, so they were independent from each other. And until 1410, the kings of the Crown of Aragon descended from Wilfred the Hairy through the male line. The Principality of Catalonia had a larger population than the kingdoms of Aragon or Mallorca, and had a more flourishing economy than that of Aragon, simply because it had better land and maritime communications for trade and more fertile lands. Not because Catalans were superior by birth, as some Catalan nationalists will say. With this, what I want to convey is that it's a mistake and a manipulation to try to denigrate Catalonia and its history, because officially, instead of being a kingdom, it was a principality. Now, you might wonder, if in practice Catalonia functioned like a kingdom, why was it kept as a principality? According to the traditional interpretation popularized by the medievalist Ramon de Badal, the reason Catalonia was not a kingdom is that the counts did not dare to do so out of political prudence and legal scrupulousness. Because theoretically, until the Treaty of Corbeil in 1258, the Catalan counties legally belonged to the King of France. After signing the treaty, James I or his successors did not elevate Catalonia to a kingdom because they were already kings in Aragon. This interpretation is erroneous because it is presentist. Talking about declarations and recognitions of independence is typical of the late modern and contemporary periods, and the Treaty of Corbeil was not the legalization of a more than 200-year-old illegality, but an alliance between two 13th century kings who renounced mutual rights and claims to avoid conflict and focus their energies on other fronts. In the chronicles and official documents of the 12th century, the fabricated narrative that Wilfred the Hairy obtained the county of Barcelona from the Carolingian kings in full sovereignty was already being publicized, so there was no fear of what the King of France might say. Abadal's thesis is based on interpretations of some authors from the late Middle Ages and early modern period, who could present a history more favorable to royal power or more in favor of the autonomy of the nobles, depending on their own interests and benefactors, as the historical discourse had an impact on the type of political relationship of the social estates regarding the Prince of Catalonia. If we look at Iberian examples, we know that Aragon, Castile, or Portugal evolved from counties to kingdoms. Aragon evolved from a county to a kingdom because its rulers descended from the kings of Pamplona. Castile was elevated from a county to a kingdom because the Castilian count was also a son of the king of Pamplona, and because the count became king of Leon. And the king of Portugal essentially became a vassal king thanks to the external recognition of the Pope and the king of Leon and Castile. To legitimize their rule, some Iberian kingdoms like Asturias, Leon, or to a lesser extent Pamplona in Navarre, claimed descent from the Visigoths, the former rulers overthrown by the Muslim conquest. And if their mythical ancestors had been kings, so should they enjoy this status. Although they could present themselves as Goths to oppose the Franks, the Catalan counts did not claim to be descendants of the Visigothic kings, because from the archives they were aware, and could not erase from history, that the legitimacy of the counts depended on designations that Carolingian kings had made to their ancestors. Thus, family legitimacy is one of the arguments given by historian Cristian Palomo Reina to explain why Catalonia was not a kingdom. Although in this case, it is somewhat weak in my opinion, because ultimately one is a king if one wants to be, and can be through recognition both within the country and from abroad. But there are still three more internal factors that explain why Catalonia was not a kingdom but a principality. The first is due to a lack of necessity. As the Count of Barcelona was also a king of several kingdoms that made up the Crown of Aragon, he was already on par with other Christian sovereigns, and internally his royal condition already placed him in Catalonia above the rest of the counts and nobles. The second factor is the politically composite nature of medieval Catalonia, because it was born from the sum of multiple independent counties, and the political formation of Catalonia was gradual and complicated. For example, it was not until the end of the 15th century with King Ferdinand II of Aragon that the county of Pallars Sobirà came under the direct control of the monarch. But the third factor, and surely the most influential in why Catalonia was not a kingdom, is that the Catalan ruling elites wanted the sovereign of Catalonia to continue being a primus inter pares, meaning a person of the same social rank as other nobles, with the difference that he stood out for governing and administering justice. In plain terms, this means that the Catalan nobility and oligarchies did not want a ruler with overwhelmingly superior power than they had. They wanted a sovereign prince with limited authority. James I the Conqueror could adopt the title of king in territories conquered and seized from Al-Andalus such as Valencia or Mallorca, because there was no established nobility there with whom he needed to be in constant negotiation, nor older political dynamics, institutions, or laws, because those were eliminated. It is always easier to build a house from scratch than to renovate an old one. The counts, viscounts, barons, lords of castles, bishops, and abbots always showed resistance to the control that the Count of Barcelona wanted to impose on them. And if necessary, they rebelled and waged a civil war to defend their political autonomy and privileges, to the frustration of the King of Aragon and Prince of Catalonia. It is relevant to mention that the three states or branches of Catalonia took advantage of the royal weakness caused by the conquest of Sicily and the war against the papacy, France, and Naples to put in writing at the court of Catalonia in 1283 that neither Peter III of Aragon nor his successors could officially use any title other than the Count of Barcelona. This fact demonstrates the will of the Catalan ruling class not to hierarchically distance themselves from the Catalan sovereign, at least on paper, on a theoretical level. As I said before, one is a king if one wants to be, and more importantly, can be by the recognition of others. And in Catalonia, the rulers were not allowed by internal opposition. This brings us back to what I mentioned earlier, that in the 13th century the idea of Catalonia as a political entity without an all-powerful monarch emerged. And this idea was put into practice in its fullest at the beginning of the 18th century. The much hated in Catalonia King Philip V, the first king of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain, granted the Catalan courts in 1701 the greatest favors and constitutional rights to the Catalan elites. As he was a newcomer and wanted to win the favor of the Spaniards, Philip V went overboard in fulfilling all the demands of the Catalans, who in practice wanted what today we will call a constitutional monarchy, a political system regulated by constitutions and with a parliament, or assembly, with extensive legislative powers. In this system, the king was almost a figurehead, and due to the developments of the Spanish War of Succession, Philip V felt betrayed by the Catalans, was able to renege on what he had promised, and ended up abolishing the Principality of Catalonia in 1716, just like the rest of the institutions of the Crown of Aragon. This is it for today's episode. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more stories of the history of Spain, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe to New History of Spain on YouTube, and also podcast directories for the chronological series only. You can also check the Patreon at patreon.com/newhistoryspain and join the community to get benefits like early access or the ability to choose topics for new episodes. You have links that may interest you in the description. Thank you for tuning in and see you soon!